who has won a dozen Grammys, and tomorrow he will be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Right now, he's hanging out on his tour bus out on 53rd Street, so I'm going to go out there to interview the one, the only, Willie Nelson.
Willie Nelson, once a name spoken with a kind of gentle reverence across America, stood at the very peak of country music. He was the sort of figure who seemed untouchable, a simple man with a weathered face, a forever tilted cowboy hat, and a guitar that had heard every story he could tell. The world treated him like a living legend. Records sold by the millions. Stadiums were full when he played, and his rough, honest voice belonged to millions who felt that he sang for them. Yet beneath the easy smile and the steady strum was a private story of trouble that few expected. At one moment, he had everything: fame, money, and the kind of public love that makes a life feel blessed. Then, in a way that surprised many, it all began to fall apart. In the early years, Willie seemed like the classic American success story. Born into hard times and raised with the kind of grit that shapes a performer, he worked nights and highways to make songs people would remember. The country learned of him and then loved him back. His image as an outsider, a rebel against rules and polish, only fueled his appeal. He stood for freedom on the road and for honesty in music, and the industry rewarded him. Albums kept climbing the charts, tours brought crowds, and the money from records and live shows piled up. For a long time, his life looked like a string of lucky breaks that had turned into a stable fortune. But fame often pulls in more than applause. It invites advisors, agents, managers, and accountants, people meant to protect the artist's future. Willie trusted the team around him in the way many people trust the word of professionals they hire. He lived with a sense that the business side of his life was handled, that the experts were keeping things straight. Houses were bought, cars were driven, ranches were kept, and the outward life matched what the public imagined. He spent as though the income would always be there, and he assumed the people he had hired were watching the ledgers and paying the bills. Then the myth began to crack. Paperwork that should have been routine piled up in the shadows. The government, which pays careful attention to taxes, took a different view of his finances than everyone around him had expected. In a storm that stunned fans, the Internal Revenue Service announced a colossal debt, a sum that read like a final judgment. The figure they named was eye-popping. Tens of millions owed in unpaid taxes, penalties, and interest. For many, it was hard to imagine how a man who had sold so much music and toured so widely could be accused of owing such a mountain of money. What followed felt like a public auction of a private life. Investigators moved to secure assets. Homes and cars were cataloged, prized items taken down and listed, and even musical materials once considered personal were swept into reports and inventories. The images that reached the press were raw, boxes being priced, rooms emptied, personal collections recorded like items in a ledger. Fans who had only ever seen the stage now saw the other side, the boxes and stacks of papers that prove, in cold detail, how things go wrong. To a nation that loved him, the story of an American icon facing seizure and sale was both heartbreaking and dizzying. Rumors and gossip came fast. Once admirers whispered that he had lived too big and cared too little about the small, steady things that protect wealth. Critics framed his downfall as a moral tale of excess and carelessness. Meanwhile, friends and supporters pointed out the other side, that this was a man who had trusted people to manage a complicated life, and that trust had been broken. Headlines loved simplicity. He was rich, then he was in trouble. But the reality was messy and full of moments where human error, trusting the wrong person, and the cold arithmetic of the tax code all collided. When things reached the lowest point, it was not just money that was at stake, it was dignity. Auctions meant that items with deep meaning for Willie and for his fans no longer felt private. The world watched prized possessions move into unfamiliar hands. Recording masters, once safely tucked away in studios, were listed for sale. Personal objects that had been part of a lifetime of performances were priced and sold. The humiliation of seeing those things go was hard to bear for someone whose art is tied to memory and story. For a short while, the musician the country had admired looked more like a man who had been cornered by paperwork and pen than a giant who stood above such troubles. Faced with that kind of pressure, Willie did not simply bow away. He used the one possession that could not be legally taken in the moment, his music and his voice, in a bid to fight back. He recorded and released an album that read like a plea and like a strategy, a clear-minded attempt to raise money through the simplest possible means, the relationship between artist and listener. The record was more than a collection of songs. It was a plan to gather the help of fans in the form of support through what they bought and what they listened to. It was a direct appeal to the core of his career, that music had power not only to move, but to sustain. Fans answered in a way that revealed the depth of a long relationship. They bought the record not merely to enjoy tracks, but as a show of loyalty. Purchases became a kind of vote, a small rescue to ease the pressure of legal judgments. People who had grown up with his songs felt connected to the idea that their money could be practical help, that a record could translate into fewer menacing letters and fewer threats of auctions. That kind of community response was not only financial, it was emotional. For many listeners, buying the music was a way to say they still believed in the artist beyond a scandal. Even as that support arrived, and as he worked to pay off the debts, the mark of the scandal lingered. The story attached itself to him in ways that complicated interviews, tours, and new releases. Questions about money and judgment followed him into later conversations and features, and people who once thought only of his music found it easier to bring up the financial disaster. Doors that had once opened smoothly sometimes creaked. Deals were structured more tightly. Offers were measured with caution. The economic shock had effects beyond the numbers. It changed the terms on which he could operate, and it taught him lessons that had real consequences for how he managed his life going forward. There was also the human cost. Beyond accounting, beyond public sales and the press, the scandal changed how he saw the world. Shame and frustration were parts of a longer process of coming back. He had to face not only the legal machinery, but the social and emotional fallout of being seen as someone who had failed at a basic civic responsibility. That was painful in a way that had nothing to do with fame. Negotiating with the tax authorities, explaining the truth to friends and family, and enduring the public eye were experiences that left marks beyond simple balance sheets. Over time, he learned caution. The pain taught a sharper sense of oversight. He began asking more questions, demanding clarity from accountants, and surrounding himself with people he could check and recheck. The crisis nudged him toward the practical discipline that had been missing. Where before he had trusted in the goodwill of advisors, he now wanted numbers and receipts and clear accounting. That adjustment was not glamorous, but it kept him from stumbling in the same way again. Crisis, in its harsh way, pushed him toward a tougher sense of stewardship. Slowly, the public memory shifted. New albums arrived, tours continued, and interviews returned to music more than money. When he walked on stage in years after the ordeal, audiences often clapped with a kind of extra warmth, as if they were celebrating not just the songs, but the survival of the man who had written them. The outlaw image that had made him famous remained, but it was softened by a sense of humility. This was a figure who had been knocked down in public and had kept getting up. People remembered the scandal, but they remembered the music more. Time covered some wounds, and the narrative grew more complicated and more human. The episode also worked as a lesson for the industry. It became a cautionary tale about the vulnerabilities of artists who mix creativity with sudden wealth. Managers and musicians watched and learned, and the conversation shifted toward the practical realities of running a career that could easily be mismanaged. Willie's story warned that talent does not protect anyone from the slow buildup of financial problems, and that trust without verification can become a liability. That lesson, bitter as it was, spread through the small circles where artists make choices about money and lifelong careers. Friends and fellow artists sometimes spoke up to remind the public that he was more than an accountant's ledger. Letters and messages came from people who had been touched by his music in quiet moments. The farmers, the teachers, the nurses, the small business owners who had sung along in their cars. Those words of support helped sustain him in private, adding emotional weight to the financial help. The solidarity of listeners mattered as much as any payment, because it reaffirmed the bond that made his music meaningful in the first place. Even after the finances were mostly settled, the episode remained a shadow. It was part of how people told his story, a chapter that often appeared in retrospectives and biographies. The image of boxes and auction notices stayed in the mind of the public. But it did not end his influence or his ability to reach people. He continued to record, to write songs, and to perform. The music that had always been his truest language kept working. It paid bills, of course, but it also carried meaning. That sustained connection between artist and audience offered a way back from the worst of the scandal. In the end, the tale of his collapse and partial recovery reads like both a warning and a parable. It warns about the dangers of trusting without oversight and shows how even the most admired figures are vulnerable to blind spots. At the same time, it illustrates resilience, how art, community, and steady resolve can stitch a life back together after it has been ripped apart by events beyond a person's direct control. For fans and students of celebrity alike, it remains a powerful example of what can happen when the machinery of fame collides with the cold rules of money. Through music and a stubborn heart, he rebuilt a life that would endure and be remembered. Willie Nelson moved forward with a steady, quiet determination. He continued to play shows, write songs, and meet people who had been touched by his music. Each performance felt like a small repair. The applause and the stories from fans reminded him that his work mattered beyond money. Those moments were not dramatic rescues, they were steady stitches that helped put his life back together. He leaned into causes that had always mattered to him. Supporting farmers, fighting for musicians' rights, and speaking out about legal reform became ways he used his platform for others. That work brought him meaning and renewed respect. It also offered a chance to turn attention to things he cared about, and it connected him to communities who returned the favor with loyalty and support. The scandal taught him hard lessons about business. He became more careful with contracts and accounts. Instead of blindly trusting others, he asked questions and demanded clear records. He did not become paranoid, but he did become practical. Those changes protected him in the years that followed and set a new standard for how he ran his career. Younger artists observed closely. In studios and backstage, his story was passed along as advice. Hire smart people, keep an eye on the books, and do not be afraid to audit. That knowledge became part of the way new performers prepared for careers that could last decades. His experience served as a warning and a guide, painful to learn, but valuable to remember. Friends and fellow musicians offered support that mattered more than headlines. Private messages and public shows reminded him that he was not alone. People who had sung his songs in quiet kitchens or at long drives sent notes and thanks. Those gestures helped him recover emotionally and kept the focus on the music he loved. Time softened the sharpest edges of the scandal, but it remained a part of his story. Writers and biographers included the chapter about finances when they retold his life. Yet the music kept coming, and so did the audiences. When he stepped onto a stage, people often clapped with a warmth that felt like solidarity, not pity. He had fallen, and he had kept going, and that dignity mattered. The most lasting thing was how his work reflected the life he led. His songs had always honored people who keep going despite hardship, and his own life came to mirror that message. The fall showed how fragile success can be, but his recovery proved how resilience and care can rebuild what was once lost. Through simple acts of music, community, and practical wisdom, he moved on, not untouched, but stronger in ways that mattered to him and to those who listened. His story is a lesson. Fame can vanish fast, but honesty, work, and true fans remain. Rebuilding takes time, and music can be a bridge back to dignity. Many remember his mistakes and his stubborn strength to recover and community support.